All right, so welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to be diving into some pretty interesting stuff, actually, pretty heavy stuff.
Yeah.
The origins of COVID-19. You guys have sent over a ton of articles and videos, and, well, a lot of them suggest that COVID-19 might not be natural,
Right.
like, at all.
Yeah, and what's even more interesting is they all kind of point to the same three countries being involved.
Oh, really?
Russia, the United States, and China.
So, like a three-way conspiracy. This is getting interesting.
Yeah, a joint effort.
Okay, wow. But hold on, what evidence are they using to back up this wild claim?
So a lot of them highlight what they call bioweapon nomenclature they found in documents, specifically modifications to ORF10 in the virus's genetic code.
ORF10.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to need a little help here. What is ORF10 and why is it so important?
So think of it like this. The virus's genetic code is like a set of instructions on how to build proteins. And those proteins carry out all sorts of functions. ORF10 is one of those instructions. But what makes it so interesting is that it's unique to SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19. We don't see it in other coronaviruses.
So it's like an extra instruction that no one knows the purpose of.
Pretty much, yeah.
That's kind of unsettling. What are these sources saying about it?
So they suggest that this mysterious ORF10 could be the key to understanding why we see such severe clotting in COVID-19 patients.
Ah, the clotting, right.
Yeah, so they think that it might be disrupting the normal process of breaking down fibrinogen.
Now, I know fibrinogen is involved in clotting, but remind me how that whole process works.
Sure, so when you get a cut, your body needs to stop the bleeding.
Right.
That's where fibrinogen comes in. It gets converted into fibrin, which forms kind of a mesh that traps blood cells and helps create a clot.
Right, so it's like the body's natural Band-Aid.
Exactly.
But what are they saying is going wrong with this process in COVID-19 patients?
They believe that the virus, potentially through RRF10, is causing the fibrinogen to become hyperphosphorylated.
Hyperphosphorylated.
Yeah, don't worry. It's not as complicated as it sounds. It basically means that too many phosphate molecules are getting attached to the fibrinogen.
So it's like the clotting switch is getting stuck in the on position.
Exactly. And because of that, these clots are forming more easily and are much harder to break down. This could explain why we saw so many clotting complications with COVID-19.
Okay, that makes sense. And if ORF10 really is involved in this, it does kind of lend some weight to that whole bioweapon theory. But why would someone engineer a virus to do this? Like, what would be the point?
Well, one source, an unholy triad, the birth of a plague, claims that this whole thing, this whole conspiracy, was orchestrated to reduce the global population.
Wait, intentionally reduce the population? Like, that's scary.
Yeah. And they go on to describe this whole domino effect where you'd have this total loss of trust in governments, which leads to global chaos and then economic collapse.
I imagine that would also lead to even more conspiracy theories.
Oh, absolutely.
Some even crazier than the ones we're talking about today.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But not all of the sources paint such a bleak picture.
Okay.
Dr. Philip McMillan, for example, in his Vejan COVID-19 review, takes a different approach.
Oh, that's right, Dr. McMillan. He seemed a little bit more optimistic. What's his take?
He focuses on the scientific implications and the potential for breakthroughs.
Okay.
Assuming that this information about ORF10 is accurate,
Yeah.
he talks about developing new treatments like ORF10 inhibitors to stop those dangerous clots from forming. He even suggests that this could help us better understand and treat long COVID, which a lot of people are still dealing with.
Oh, wow. That is a silver lining.
Yeah.
Sounds like he sees potential for real progress in treating COVID-19, even if it is kind of unsettling to think about how we may have come across this information.
Yeah, and he also raises the question of why the public wasn't informed about these modifications if scientists were already aware of them.
Right, that seems to be a common thread throughout all these sources, this need for transparency and a global investigation. But realistically, how would that even be possible?
Yeah, it would be a huge undertaking, for sure, but all of these sources agree that it's necessary. They see it as the only way to address these really serious accusations.
Wow.
If these allegations are true, we're talking about potential crimes against humanity.
That's heavy. I'm curious to hear what these sources propose as solutions. Like, what are they calling for?
So one big theme is a complete overhaul of how bioweapon research is conducted and regulated. They want to see these international treaties with serious consequences for any country that violates them.
So basically, a whole new era of vigilance when it comes to bioweapons. Sounds like they're pushing for some pretty radical changes. I have to admit, this is all a lot to process.
Yeah, it's a lot to take in, for sure. But before we get too overwhelmed, I think it's important to remember that these are still just allegations.
Yeah.
We need more information and a thorough investigation to determine if they're true.
You're right. We need to approach all of this with a healthy dose of skepticism and keep digging for more information.
Exactly. And it's important for everyone listening to do the same.
Right.
Think critically about what you're reading and hearing. Look for different perspectives and don't be afraid to ask questions.
Yeah, that's great advice. Always question everything. We've been talking about some pretty serious allegations about the origins of COVID-19. It's a lot to take in.
Yeah, it really is. We're talking
Yes.
about the possibility that a virus was, deliberately designed to cause harm, and that's not something to take lightly.
No, absolutely not. And what the key pieces of evidence that these sources keep bringing up is this modified ORF10
Right.
and its potential role in all the clotting complications that we saw.
Right, and to understand why that's so significant, I think it helps to understand how blood clotting normally works.
Yeah, you're right. We talked a bit about fibrinogen and how it's like the body's natural Band-Aid, but I think it's worth kind of digging a little deeper into how that process works.
Definitely. So think of it like this. When you get injured and you start bleeding, your body needs a way to stop that bleeding quickly. That's where fibrinogen comes in. It's a protein that circulates in your blood just waiting for its moment to shine. And when you get a cut, it gets converted into fibrin, which forms a mesh that traps blood cells and helps create a clot.
So it's like fibrinogen is the raw material
Yeah.
and fibrin is the finished product,
Exactly.
the actual clot that stops the bleeding.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. And usually this whole process works like a well-oiled machine.
Yeah.
But what the sources are suggesting is that COVID-19, potentially through this modified ORF10, is like throwing a wrench into the gears.
Okay, so how does ORF10 fit into all of this?
Well, the sources believe that ORF10 might be causing the fibrinogen to become what's called hyperphosphorylated.
Hyperphosphorylated. Okay, I remember we talked about that earlier, but I'm still not entirely clear on what that means.
Okay, so basically, like, imagine fibrinogen has a bunch of little switches on it. These switches can be flipped on or off by attaching phosphate molecules to them.
Okay.
And when a switch is flipped on, it changes how the fibrinogen behaves.
So in this case, hyperphosphorylation means that too many of these switches are getting flipped on.
Exactly. And when too many switches are flipped on, it causes the fibrinogen to become like super sticky.
Yeah.
And it starts forming clots way too easily.
So the clotting mechanism is going into overdrive.
Precisely. And not only are these clots forming more easily, but they're also much harder to break down.
Oh, wow.
And this could explain why we saw such a high incidence of blood clots in COVID-19 patients.
It's a pretty terrifying thought, and it makes you wonder if this was intentional. Could someone have modified the virus to specifically cause this kind of, clotting chaos?
That's the question a lot of these sources are raising. And if they're right, it suggests a level of, malicious intent that's pretty hard to even fathom.
Yeah. It's certainly disturbing. We talked about that population control theory. But are there any other motives that these sources explore? Like, why would someone do something like this?
Well, some sources suggest that this could be a case of biological warfare gone wrong.
Okay.
So maybe the virus was intended to be a weapon, but it accidentally escaped from a lab.
So a kind of oops, our bad scenario on a global scale.
It would be a pretty catastrophic oops, but it's a possibility that some of these sources are considering.
I guess even with the best intentions, accidents can happen. But then you have to wonder what kind of research were they doing that led to this kind of accident in the first place?
Yeah, that's a question that a lot of people are asking, and it raises some serious concerns about the oversight and regulation of, bioweapons research.
Absolutely. And then there's the possibility that this wasn't an accident at all, that maybe this was a deliberate act of aggression, a way to destabilize, rival nations or gain some sort of political or economic advantage.
Right. Some sources speculate that the virus could have been intentionally released, as a form of biological warfare. It's a chilling thought.
It is. It's hard to even wrap your head around the implications of something like that. If these allegations are true, it would represent a complete breakdown of international trust and cooperation.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We're talking about a potential paradigm shift in global relations. It would be incredibly difficult to to rebuild trust after something like this.
And what about the impact on scientific research itself? Could this lead to more, restrictions, more regulations, potentially hindering scientific progress?
It's definitely possible. I mean, after something like this, there's bound to be a lot more scrutiny on research involving viruses, genetic engineering.
Yeah.
We might see a push for much stricter oversight and control, which could have unintended consequences for legitimate scientific exploration.
Right. It's a tough situation. On the one hand, we need to make sure that, scientific knowledge isn't misused,
Yeah.
for harmful purposes.
Mm.
But on the other hand, we don't want to stifle innovation. We don't want to prevent important discoveries from being made.
It's a delicate balance. And finding that balance is going to require a lot of careful consideration,
Yeah.
open dialogue between scientists, policymakers, and the public. We need to have a serious conversation about the ethical implications of this kind of research and how to ensure that it's conducted responsibly.
It sounds like these allegations, even if they're not fully proven, could have far-reaching consequences that go way beyond the immediate impact of the pandemic itself.
That's exactly right. We're potentially talking about a fundamental shift in how we view science, international relations, even our own safety and security in the world.
Yeah, it's a lot to process. It raises a lot of questions about what the future holds. I'm curious to hear more about what these sources propose as potential solutions. Like what can we do to prevent something like this from happening again?
Well, one thing that comes up repeatedly is this need for greater transparency and accountability in scientific research, particularly when it comes to, potentially dangerous areas like virology and genetic engineering.
Right. That makes sense. If we don't know what kind of research is being conducted, it's impossible to assess the risks or put safeguards in place. But how do we achieve that level of transparency without, stifling scientific progress?
It's a challenging question, and there's no easy answer. But I think it starts with, open dialogue and collaboration
Mm-hmm.
between scientists, policymakers, and the public. We need to foster an environment where scientists feel comfortable sharing their work and where concerns about potential risks can be openly discussed and addressed.
So it's about building trust and ensuring that scientific research is conducted in a way that benefits humanity and not, harms it.
Exactly. And it also involves, educating the public about the scientific process, the potential risks and benefits of research, and the importance of, ethical considerations. The more informed people are, the better equipped they'll be to participate in these important conversations and hold those in power accountable.
That's a great point. This isn't just about scientists and policymakers. It's about all of us taking an active role in shaping the future of science and ensuring that it's used for good.
Absolutely. We all have a stake in this. And as we move forward, I think it's essential to remember that while these allegations are concerning, they also present an opportunity for us to reflect, to learn, and to work together to create a safer and more responsible future.
That's a good point. It's easy to get caught up in all the fear and uncertainty, but it's important to remember that we have the power to learn from this and to make positive changes.
Exactly. We can use this as a catalyst to build a more transparent, accountable, and ethical approach to scientific research. And ultimately, that's what will help us prevent something like this from happening again.
Well said. So while these allegations are undoubtedly unsettling, they also offer a chance for growth and progress. It's a reminder that we're all in this together and that we have a collective responsibility to ensure that science is used for the betterment of humanity.
It's a call to action for all of us to engage in these critical conversations, demand transparency and accountability, and work toward a future where scientific knowledge is used responsibly and ethically.
And speaking of the future, it's time for us to wrap up this part of our deep dive. But don't go anywhere, because when we come back, we'll be exploring some of the potential long-term consequences of these allegations and what they might mean for the world as we know it. Stay tuned.
So welcome back to the deep dive. We've been spending this episode kind of exploring this whole idea that COVID-19 might have been engineered, like a bioweapon. Yeah, we've looked at the sources you sent us, which suggest this potential conspiracy. Russia, the U.S., China, and we talked about some of the scientific details, especially the whole ORF10 thing and how it might be connected to those clotting complications.
Right, right. And so now, as we wrap up, I kind of want to shift gears a little and think about the future. Like, what are some of the long-term consequences of all these allegations, even if they don't lead to any definitive proof?
Yeah, that's a big question. Even without like a smoking gun, just having these allegations out there could really change things.
Yeah.
One of the biggest things I think we might see is an impact on public trust.
Oh, absolutely. It's hard to imagine that trust in governments and scientific institutions can fully recover if a lot of people believe these allegations.
Exactly. And, we're already seeing people being more skeptical of authority figures. These allegations, whether or not they're true,
Hmm.
could just make that distrust even worse.
Right.
And that could lead to, more polarization, more social unrest.
Yeah, it's like a crack in the foundation of society. Even if you try to repair it, the damage is still there.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
And this loss of trust could have, ripple effects on everything.
Right.
Public health initiatives, international cooperation.
It's kind of scary to think about trying to coordinate a global response to another pandemic, in a world where no one trusts governments or scientists.
Yeah, it would be really difficult, maybe even impossible.
Yeah.
And that's a scary thought because, our world is so interconnected and
Right.
we're seeing new diseases pop up all the time.
Yeah. This makes me wonder about the future of scientific research. Could this lead to a more like restrictive environment for research?
It's definitely possible. We might see people pushing for stricter controls and regulations, especially in sensitive areas like virology and genetic engineering.
But wouldn't that possibly slow down, scientific progress?
Yeah, it's a tough balance.
Yeah.
We need to protect against misuse of scientific knowledge, but we also don't want to stop new discoveries from happening.
Right, right. So how do we navigate that? How do we find that balance?
Well, it takes a thoughtful approach, one that involves scientists, policymakers, and the public all talking to each other.
I think you hit a really important point there, just the need for people to understand science better.
Oh, absolutely. If people understand the scientific process, the risks, the benefits, all the ethical stuff, then they can actually participate in these conversations.
Right.
And they can hold the people in charge accountable.
So it's about giving people the tools to think critically, to ask questions, and to demand transparency.
Exactly. We can't just accept everything we're told. We need to be informed, we need to be engaged, and we need to hold our leaders accountable.
So even though all of these allegations are pretty unsettling, I guess there's also an opportunity here. A
Yeah.
chance to kind of step back and think about the role of science, the need for transparency, and how important it is for everyone to understand science.
Yeah, it's a chance to have some tough conversations, learn from what's happened, and try to build a better future, a more informed future.
Well said. Well, I think that's about all the time we have for today's deep dive. We've covered a lot, explored some pretty wild possibilities and grappled with some big questions.
Yeah.
You know, these are complicated issues. There are no easy answers. We encourage you to keep learning about this stuff, seek out different opinions, talk about this with people.
Yeah, have those conversations.
Because at the end of the day, the choices we make today are what will shape the future. So stay curious, stay informed, stay engaged. Until next time, keep digging.